My mission is to teach history through art and to make people think more critically about false narratives. I'm Jim McMurtry, and welcome to my classroom. The painting, or in this case, engraving that we're looking at today comes from an old book, and you can see it on the screen. And it surrounds a story that's been much repeated, certainly in schools. And I'd like to tell you the story about a Nootka chief by the name of Maquinna. And as you can see in the illustration, there are a lot of Nootka indigenous warriors in cedar dugout canoes. And they were trading with a ship. The ship was called the Boston, and it was full of Americans. There were 27 of them, and they were there to exchange European goods, many of the metal goods, guns, axes, knives, saws, nails, and so on. Traps, animal traps are very popular. Pots, I would think, have been particularly useful with with the local tribes, and in return would take the valuable item of animal furs, whether it's otter, beaver, or many different animals. They also sold fish, so they got that from the Nootkenders. What's fascinating about the story is how it's presented in a way that I think is, well, false. and and the lessons that I do here are in part in reaction to the fact that for years as a social studies or history teacher, that I used textbooks and followed curricula that presented Maquinna as a hero. And these unfortunate traders, explaining them, they were unfortunate, as is in some way guilty. As, well, I guess the word that people use today is colonialism, but they were people who were just trying to make a buck, trying to survive, as we all still do today. So the story is this: that they were trading over several days, and then the Europeans felt comfortable and went on shore, and also had the Nootka come on board. And after one, again, many different versions of this story, but one has them supping together, the Nootka bringing salmon on board and everybody eating together. And afterwards, all the men aboard who were, again, traders, but they would have had individual responsibilities, whether it's that of a sailor or a map maker, a cook. In the case of one particular person, we'll be talking a lot about it, was as a blacksmith. So anyhow, the Nook took to arms very unexpectedly. Nine of the 27 were on land visiting the local village. They too had no idea, not conscious at all of there being any possibility of violence. And the central character to this story is a man named John Jewett, and he was not above board with everybody else. He was down below, and he was doing the work that he did as a blacksmith or armorer, and that would be to make knives and fix guns and so on. And he heard a commotion, and when he went up to investigate, he was hit in the face with an axe, and because he was off balance, and so was the person that struck him. He wasn't killed, but he fell back down into the area where he'd come from, and presumed to be dead. So all 27 were presumed to be dead, but it turned out that two didn't die. And when Jewett recovered enough, he was taken up above, and you could see 25 heads of his of his fellow crew, the heads lined in a row, and in a pool of blood and intestinal fluid, and it was a pretty awful sight. The other man that wasn't killed, they thought they killed him. His name was John Thompson. Was a lot older, 20 years older than Jewett. So Jewett knew, had a sense that Maquinna and others realized what his role was and that he was of value. So when he knew that they were going to keep him alive, he said that the other fellow was his father and that he wouldn't agree to help them if they killed John Thompson. For 28 months, Jewett and Thompson lived in amongst the Nootka as slaves. And both men referred to Maquinna as chief or as king. And they were not terribly treated. And I won't really go into details there. And there are books that have been written, including a book by Jewett himself. But when he was discovered by another trading ship 28 months later, he was found wrapped in a bearskin, and his skin, his own skin, was painted in black and red colors. He had green leaves and the top knot on his head, and he looked like the other Nootka. And so he found a way of communicating to the trading ship that had come in called the Lydia and got them to rescue him and Thompson. And he was successful being rescued and eventually made his way back to where he originally was from, which was Boston, Massachusetts. Um, what's interesting to me, there are many things that are fascinating about the story again, but what the false narrative that I would like to center attention on is the fact that Maquinna is well remembered today. He's remembered by a point, by a provincial park, by two schools. In the Legislative Assembly, the legislature, the provincial government building in Victoria for British Columbia, there are 14 statues of people who are historically important. And Maquinna is remembered in one of them. And I find that a little bit surprising because Maquinna wasn't somebody that I would think anybody would want to emulate. The 25 men that he had killed were not the first Europeans that he'd killed. So, not even talking about those who lost their lives who were Indigenous, but there were other Europeans that were captured and enslaved and killed by Maquinna. He had at all times about 50 slaves, 9 wives, and so not an exemplary life. Now he ended up, and maybe in part because Jewett was valuable to him, and again making metal knives, fixing his guns. But they also did create, and all people have good qualities. And Maquinna was able to create a friendship of sorts with Jewett, which was quite interesting. And Jewett was able to marry one of the Nootka women and had a son. And when he left, of course, he never had contact again with either wife or son. It wouldn't have been safe for him to do that. So while we're talking about Maquinna here, I've got in the back of my head somebody else that I'd like to briefly talk about, and that was our first prime minister, the founder of the deal maker that made it possible to bring the different parts of Canada together. Originally, it was 4 provinces. We had the Maritimes, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and then we also had Ontario and Quebec, Canada, West and East, and Canada was formed, and it was not easy, particularly the antagonism between the English and French. And so Canada would not be here today, in all likelihood, if it weren't for, certainly in the form that we know it, or the size and grandeur that we know it, if it weren't for MacDonald. So while there's schools named after Maquinna, 2 already in British Columbia, and maybe there'll be more, they're renaming schools that were given MacDonald's name. One in Kingston, which was his hometown or near where he was born, Picton, and but where he lived much of his life. and Toronto and likely other places. So it's a rather interesting thing because MacDonald, well, the reason he has fallen into disgrace is because his associates with residential schools, and in my view, residential schools were offered an education for children who otherwise wouldn't have had any. Without going deeply into that issue, MacDonald also created a program that helped reduce drastically the famine that was visited upon native groupings in the western part of Canada, particularly as a result of the demise of the bison or buffalo herds. That he brought vaccinations to Indigenous communities. He formed the RCMP. He brought law and order. There were no in Canadian history. There are no or were no Indian wars. In the US, there were 50. So many people, reasonable people, would argue that Sir John A MacDonald saved more Indigenous lives than any other prime minister in our history. So it's an interesting thing that we are raising a man who, with one trading ship in particular, um, and for no reason, for no justifiable reason, decided to kill everybody. But they too were marked for death. And then somebody else who never killed anybody is somebody that we don't want to be remembered. So I don't know. They say that history is written by the victors. I'm not sure that's true. I think what's happened in recent decades is there's a movement afoot to disgrace all the Europeans that made Canada in very important ways into a country that is a beacon of democracy and law, order, and good government. And to raise, to glorify, sanctify um, Indigenous chiefs who certainly too had a role, but certainly did contribute to the construction of our country. But to put MacDonald and Maquinna, and Maquinna means, by the way, possessor of pebbles, and no chief ended up with the wealth that he had without, of course, hoarding what the tribe had. To put Maquinna on the same moral plane as MacDonald would, to me, be wrong. But what we're doing in Canada is we're putting him above MacDonald. And so I hope in listening to these lessons that you maybe look at history a little differently than your teachers might have told you to do in school. Thank you.